Hello, and welcome to Code Embers, your informatics low-key healthcare podcast that feeds on data and connects concepts to the elements. I'm John Manning, an EM doc and informatician in Charlotte, North Carolina, the good Queen City.
And I'm Mike Wang. I am a hospitalist and clinical informaticist practicing in the Bay Area.
All of the views and discussions that we have are our own thoughts and opinions, which we are happy to share with anyone. How are you doing, Mike?
Good. How are COVID things going over on your side?
Pretty well. Staying masked, getting fully vaccinated. Somewhat recently, actually had the chance to help some of our region vaccinate by actually administering vaccines, which I thought was really nice. Quoting the person who invited me, and I think this is accurate, it's a nice chance to recharge and see people smile, and certainly they were thankful. How's it been on your side?
It's been okay. I think the Bay Area has been fairly lucky with our numbers. Certainly doing much better than Southern California has been in the last few months.
That's fair. So, this podcast is primarily designed around clinical informatics and the things that are related to that. And I think a lot of the people that may be listening may be considering or questioning, well, what is informatics in the first place? And I'm curious as to what your thought or perspective or definition is for informatics, and I will give the same.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's interesting. I think that's a definition that in practice has really evolved for me over time. I think when I first started thinking about clinical informatics, it just felt like you had a bunch of techie doctors who were good at troubleshooting their printers, and eventually kind of got moved into more technology-focused roles just because they were willing to be techie. I think as things have changed and evolved, it's become a much more sophisticated kind of field now. Like we now do a lot of big data work. We do a lot of implementation work and a lot of change management work that I think both of us got out of our clinical informatics subspecialty. I think if I were to sum up clinical informatics in an elevator pitch that I give to my friends and family who are not in the space, which is most of them, it comes down to managing just the flow of information in the hospital. And I'm a hospitalist, so I'm biased towards the inpatient side, obviously. But I think just managing the flow of information in the healthcare system. How do you get data from various parts of the healthcare organization to the right people who need to see it at the right time? I think a lot of it does revolve around sort of the clinical decision-making kind of 5 rights of information. So I think in a lot of ways it's a funny definition because it broadens to some extent the definition beyond just like things on the computer, because things like faxes and pictures are often also information and not always digital. So I like to think that those are actually within our domain now as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, and the elevator pitch that I typically give is how you deal with, store, and communicate data for information. So information is the root word. We work with data, and that could be the apps on your phone. That could be your electronic health records. That could be, the sheet of paper that you write or that you use for a Glasgow coma scale or things along those lines. And you're right. I agree that the information that can be on a piece of paper, when you're using that to add to your clinical care and clinical practice, harnessing and managing said data, I think, fits within informatics. There is within our core content, which is available on American Board of Preventive Medicine's website, and I'll link this in the show notes. But we have core content available, and this fits within cognitive bioinformatics, like how you are thinking and how that impacts other people. And so one example is internal cognition is how much you can keep in memory, both long and short term, as well as the working memory that you have. And the external cognition being, I use the term like a GCS on a wall, or things that you are using as a decision support tool within your EHR is a good example. And then distributed cognition is multiple people coming together for the care of a single patient. much in the same way as you have a bunch of people that are. You cannot have one person run a submarine. It has to be done together as a team. And I think the way that we are managing and communicating said data for those ways that we think are really important.
Yeah. It's funny that, I know you and I have talked about this definition for the last 4 or 5 years, and it's funny that we've kind of converged on like a very similar definitions.
Yeah, it's almost like we've talked about this a lot for some reason. With that in mind, how do you define, well, I guess we could at least introduce the koi pond, because I think some aspect of that came from our shared discussions as fellows trying to figure out what informaticians or informaticists actually do and what career options that we had available to us.
Yeah, I mean, this was the work that we should probably also link in the show notes.
Yeah.
I think we came up with this. It was funny. We were such wide-eyed, open, naive fellows at the time we first came up with this idea. Actually, it was even that first year, right? When that first AMIA that we met, I think.
Yeah. 2016.
Where we started discussing this.
Yeah.
Wow, it's been a long time.
2016. Yes. And just to define it, because there have been, we had several iterations of this, but what remained stable over the years was KOI. And we're, I guess we're going to start with our first element analogy of fish in a pond. So we're going to tie everything to water today. But KOI stands for knowledge, operations, and innovation. And you're always working with data, but if you were taking said data to advance your overall knowledge of something, that's K. And a good example with that would be some of the excellent work that you do with data warehouse queries for EHR access logs, specifically looking at burnout, or you can do that for provider efficiency or things like that. Mm-hmm. O is when you take insights from your data and apply them to the majority of your end users. And so if you think about the diffusion of innovation curve, that's pretty much everyone. And you can do this with, this is where change management really shines, and project management and understanding the entire life cycle of an informatics-based project. That is heavy into operations. And then innovation is the stuff that is a little too early to deploy broadly. So usually the people that are the far left of the diffusion of innovation curve, or if it's so new, you're creating brand new technology that did not previously exist. So that's writing code or intellectual property or things like that. So you take those 3 parts, always with data, but done in certain ways, and then combine it based on where you're practicing or what your efforts are, be it inside a health system, outside, or the policy and governance that keeps it healthy. And now you have a 3x3 table of all the things that you do and where your skill set lies. And yeah, every informatician is different and unique. And we liked KOI because it really helped fit with the analogy, because all of them have different patterns, colors, and scales.
Yeah, and I think to give context behind why we came up with this framework, it really was just, when we were thinking about career paths, it was difficult to figure out which portions of roles fit into what things, and figure out what skill sets you needed to really develop to prepare yourself for a given part of the KOI. And I think it really, certainly for me, has helped prioritize what skills I need to develop in order to be prepared to serve roles in the various parts of that framework.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that's also the value of the people that are going through informatics fellowship now, is that you need to learn at least a basic skill set of each of those. Howard Silverman wrote about domains of clinical informatics practice, and we define this as focus areas. So KOI are your focus areas that really define kind of the tasks that you're doing, because implementing for the majority is very different than writing code or doing, another good example of like a design sprint, or doing design thinking work and, A/B testing and stuff like that. It's very different from going heavily into a data warehouse or a data lake and finding the information from scratch, and then tying that to your knowledge of clinical practice. It's a very different wheelhouse.
Yep. And all needed and all part of the same profession, but almost like they're almost like subspecialties within the specialty.
Yeah, and each person has their own interests and strengths, and the argument that we give is we think that it augments your core content, because if you have a core content interest in X, Y, or Z, so my interest is human factors and usability, but it could just as easily be cybersecurity. So let's say you have cybersecurity as your stated interest, which is extremely important right now. Well, you can take the knowledge from this and just turn that into publications or, policy and guidance of how we as a nation should be addressing healthcare cybersecurity, or, speaking at academic events. Or you could be implementing this in your system. Or you could be creating the new algorithms and ways that you can approach keeping your health system safe, be it from the perspective of inside the health system or outside, because a lot of informaticians are in the vendor space these days. They are entrepreneurs and innovators that are across the board. Some are inside of a big subspecialty organization, and some are for a large vendor, or a small down to a small startup.
Yep. Or startups of one,
or
half of
or
one,
an N of one. Yes.
Startups with an FTE of like 0.2.
Yes, that's true. But realistically, I think the benefit being, especially if you're going through a fellowship, is to learn what's important as a whole, be as broad as you can, so that you understand how to adapt. Because I think we as informaticians or informaticists do a very good job of adapting.
Yep.
We can't even pick a title, but then lean into the strengths that you also have, and so that you can be very good at a lot of things, but hyper specialize in the thing that you think is your best strength.
Yep. Well, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of maybe the value of the Clinical Informatics Fellowship? What that's done for you personally, and sort of like what you think, if you have any thoughts on how fellowships should move forward from here.
Yeah. Well, I'll just lead with the bias that they should follow Koi Pond, because it makes sense, and I think it was very helpful. And the fellows that I've spoken to since we published this have been pretty appreciative of that as a practice. In fellowship, I tracked my projects along that paradigm, and now years later, I guess it's been 4 years out almost, I still do that in terms of where I'm tracking where I spend my efforts. And I made I'll just call this a spreadsheet of where my interests were and where I was keeping track of my projects, and putting a 0 up to 5 of where within each of that 3x3 table my interest and my efforts would lie, and then I use that every maybe 6 months or a year. I'll look back and say, oh well, how close am I, understanding that may shift over time. And it's been relatively stable, I think, over the last 2 years. My path is going to be different from another informatician's. And I'm an emergency doctor by training, but my mentor was family medicine, and my program director was a pathologist. And at some point in time, with the other fellows that were going through or around that training program, we had 7 fellows representing 5 different specialties of medicine.
Yeah, you guys had a pretty diverse group over there.
We did, yeah. And when you think about it, how often or in how many other locations are you going to learn about something that is so drastically different than your primary area of practice? Good example, we had for over a year 2 pathologists and an emergency doctor evaluating and handwriting timestamps of operating room turnover times, patient out to patient in, from a pediatric anesthesiologist Lean Six Sigma black belt, so that we could do operational and change management techniques. And that's really cool. I don't think you get that otherwise.
Yeah. No, I mean, come on, we're physicians, right? Our specialty is always the best one, and everybody else just doesn't appreciate what we do, or is as good at it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's strength to that, and then there's challenge, because I think if you're looking at the value of the physician informatician, which we'll be talking about at AMIA's Clinical Informatics Conference upcoming, one challenge is that physicians have gone through a large majority of their life in nonstop education. You're averaging at least 25 years, up to 27 to 30, just in school, from kindergarten through graduation of fellowship. So that's a quarter century per informatician that is working in this system. So they are a little bit expensive, but all of that education and the knowledge and the value that they have that they can apply to all of their years of guided clinical practice and practice beyond can apply in ways that I think are unique, just as unique as it is to work with pharmacy specialists who are in informatics, nursing informaticians, dentistry, data analysts who specialize in that, developers, PhDs, biostatisticians, and librarians. So our strength is, I think, in large part, the extremely rigorous amount of medical education that we've had to undergo and really dive very deeply into. It is very difficult, I think, to go, even into medical school. And as you're going through that whole process, you learn a lot. And then if you take those values and those elements that you learn and take it from a perspective of an informatician and then apply that around data and workflow and helping get blueprints before build and other aspects of, trying to make your life easier as a clinician for other people, then instead of just the care that you're doing for the service of individual patients, you're now on the population scale, and you're doing this to make your peers more efficient. So I don't think any of us are better than the other, because I don't think we could work together without them. Or without any of those other backgrounds or strengths, just like with, when you're looking at it from the perspective of keeping that broad lens of different specialties and collaborating with people that are nowhere near your specialty. I think there's really a lot of value in the physician informatician, or informaticist, if you want to call us that.
Yeah. I don't think there's a standard term.
No, and
a standard term hasn't congealed there either.
No, and it's a new specialty. I mean, we've only had 8 years of board exams. It was first announced in September of 2011. They had their first round of boards in October of 2013. And people have been doing informatics for decades, but as a board certified subspecialty of medicine through pathology or through the American Board of Preventive Medicine, it's only 8 years old by that definition.
Yeah.
And we are also a subspecialty without RVUs because we don't bill for our informatics practice, which then makes it difficult to justify our value unless you can find that hard return on investment.
Yeah.
Now, what's your favorite aspect of some of the stuff that you're doing today, Mike?
I think speaking to your point, it's the versatility and the flexibility around what I do. I generally like to think that I am very mission driven, and that I like to look at what's going around in the areas where I have expertise in, and figure out what things are broken, and then figure out what needs to be solved to address those issues. And so I think being an informaticist has really allowed me to kind of break down the institutional walls that I would have maybe been more stuck in as just like a pure hospitalist, let's say, and really work with industry, work in academics and policy. It's just, it gives me a wider breadth of tools by which to solve problems, which, really wouldn't have been available to me just if I was just practicing medicine as a clinical hospitalist.
Yeah. And well, each of us has had a different path, as mentioned, because I think, the more you talk to informaticians, the more you find some really cool stories. But you were a developer for EHR vendor before you went into medicine, right?
Yeah.
How is that translated over to what you do now?
Oh, I mean that job with the EHR vendor is where I first learned to do database querying, and that has become almost a anchor in my career since then. It was my first data exposure to, well, it wasn't quite my first exposure to databases, but it was my first like experience being a professional data person, whatever that means.
Yeah.
And like I think just because I've had that skill set, it continues to be something around which I revolve. I certainly couldn't have predicted in 2006 that healthcare would be kind of on the trend that it is now with a lot of the consumer level kind of big data work. I mean, I did a lot of when I was doing research in college. I had some sense that big data would come, but I always thought it would come from more of the omics data, like because I was doing a lot of genetics research and omics research. So I kind of thought it would come from there, but I had no idea. Like I certainly couldn't have anticipated that we would have super fancy smartphones and like EKGs on watches. Like it's so funny to think back and just be like, oh, that's like never going to happen, right?
I mean, trying to consume said data without a specialist or the ability to make it as easy for the end user is like trying to sip from a fire hose. You get nothing but noise and very little signal.
Yeah, and I think even understanding who that end user is, right, is something that is not always fully appreciated, right? Is it the patient? Is it the physician? Usually it's both. And there's a lot of overlap between what they want to consume, but it's there's nuances that and certain amounts of like validated actions, right, that need to be done for those two audiences.
Yeah. Do you still use the Jankiness scale?
I do use the Jankiness scale.
Do you want to explain what that is? Because I love it, and I've used that term where I work, and it's spread to others.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
So as someone who codes, and specifically someone who writes a lot of SQL reports to extract data, I started assigning a Jankiness score to all the code that I wrote. And those of you who have come from software backgrounds can have some sense of this, which is basically like how much do I think this output of the code that I wrote is complete jank. So if something has a Jankiness score of 10, like I literally looked at like the FAQ and wrote like 3 lines of code around it, like please don't use this ever, this is like a proof of concept. Whereas if I don't think I've ever gotten to like a Jankiness score of like 0. The Jankiness is always like, I would say my minimum Jankiness is like 3 or a 4, but that means I've probably invested like 100 hours into a particular like set of data.
Yeah. And essentially proving that it's true and it matches with the clinical picture. So giving the example of when we were in the operating room for turnover times, we were handwriting in the timestamps. And then we looked at the nurses and techs and people that were doing documentation, and then dove into the warehouse to find exactly where those timestamps were. And that gave us a very low Jankiness score, but you're not necessarily going to be able to do that for every project that you do. If you're making an app, as a good example, and I have a little bit of knowledge in that, but if you are making an app, then if the screen skips or you get it where it's just not responding, or you get frames that get dropped, they call that jank. And I think part of whenever we were having these discussions with my own institution was people were, well, first off, I was explaining what jank was, and then explaining why some of these queries had a Jankiness scale or score attached to them, understanding that medical and clinical data requires finesse to look through and understand.
I'm curious, sort of like along this, certainly related to the Jankiness score, what percentage of your project time do you think is spent doing like validation of data?
It's interesting because these days I'm also working every week, an hour and a half every week, with a data analyst and billing specialist. And part of it, we are doing data visualization, and in part of it, we are doing data validation. And so it's a set amount of that for projects that, I started almost 4 years ago. And it's always a never-ending target of making sure that the data that we have available match the clinical picture and doing it in a way that's useful and actionable for the people that are consuming said data.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. All of the analytics work that I do, if I do it purely unvalidated based on whatever's in the documentation, I would say it takes me like 20% of the time or 30% of the time to write those queries, but I don't trust those. Time and time again, when I go and see whether the documentation lines up with the real world data, it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean it takes effort, and it takes investment. You write your own queries. Do you connect it to R as well?
Sometimes. It depends on your environment, but like certainly for mine, I'll connect it to R if I need to automate some sort of like data extraction pipeline, to pull it all the way through, like so I can do like basically hit run in R and it'll do the whole thing in 12 hours or something. But if it's just a one-off thing, I usually won't.
Cool. Awesome. What suggestions would you give for rising or aspiring informaticians who are interested in learning how to harness tools such as the ones that you use with your within your knowledge bucket? We'll just leave it that way.
Yeah. I would say find a project. Find something you care about. If you are at an institution where they'll let you learn to write your own queries and things, take advantage of that, because that is even if you don't end up like me and John and code
yes,
in your spare time / for research purposes, it just helps you understand what that process looks like, and it helps you communicate better with those people who are going to do your coding. And a lot of times you can anticipate better the roadblocks that they're going to run into than they can anticipate, because they don't have your clinical background. Ultimately, as you work with that, data people, they'll learn a little bit more about clinical medicine and develop the instincts there. But often, as a clinical informaticist, you're sort of the person who has to understand the technology a little bit more to anticipate some of those roadblocks.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, I think I think it's it's very much code wins, right? Just go do something. And if you have, I would say the best recommendation I would give to any aspiring clinical informaticist is don't label yourself as non-technical. If you consider yourself non-technical, there's no such thing as technical or non-technical in my mind. It's sort of like it's almost like, how much stubbornness do you have to go and solve the problem that you want to solve? Like if it ends up being that your skill set and background make you more efficient in managing non-technical things, great, go that direction. But don't call yourself non-technical, because it's you have chosen not to be technical, which is fine.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make you inherently non-technical.
Yeah. I took 0 developer classes in college. Exactly 0. I was an applied physics minor. I took one course that was around going from the ones and zeros up to assembler language, but mostly like, you messing around with the circuitry, but nothing in development.
You did MATLAB. It's an applied physics major.
Yeah.
Don't lie.
Well, no comment. But I think that's what I would say, just to add to that, is even 5 or 6 years ago, I also had considered myself not a technical person or not a developer. Yeah, I'd done some things with Microsoft Access, some queries with that, and then I learned a little bit about the next thing for the project that I was doing right there, and then it built and it kept building. And if you take just like one single small step outside of your comfort zone, and then do that and learn it and get inspired by it, and then take another step a few months later, maybe 6, and then take another step. After 2 years, you will turn back and be impressed with the stuff that you've done. And you don't want to jump 5 steps into something that is extremely difficult and you really just can't wrap your head around. But anyone can design, anyone can code, anybody can do these aspects that are important for the path of informatics as a whole to
Yeah.
advance.
Yeah.
I agree entirely.
I mean, it's like, especially for the physicians listening to this, right? Like, you've done MCATs, you've done step 1, step 2, right? You've done a lot of tests that require a lot of logic. That is all coding is, and you have the skills to code, and it's really just a matter of whether it's a priority to you or not. And if some, and I would encourage anybody who feels blocked technically on a project they're working on to take a stab at doing it yourself. And you know what? Maybe, or ask somebody who does know how to do it, who may not be able to help you for your project, but ask someone who would know how to do it, and just ask them, like, hey, like, is there a way for me to do this quickly? If I just learned it myself. And if the answer is no, this is something that's going to take like a full-time, like, senior developer 2 years to code, then okay, maybe don't take that on. But if it's sort of like, yeah, you just, write this little short thing here, and you copy and paste this, and then modify this little segment, and then you'll be good to go. Like, a lot of times it is just that, to kind of get done what you need done.
Yeah, I agree. So this is a new podcast. This is episode 1. I'm still trying to figure out a good way to end this off. And, I think the way that I've put it together, that we're, this is super low key. We're going to talk mostly about data and informatics things, but
Yeah.
I like that we're going to connect concepts to the elements. And what I mean by that is the koi pond is a pond. We're using water as our element. And I think it might be cool to end with a different element, or, change it up each time. And this time I'm going to pick fire. And okay. I'm going to ask you, Mike, officially, what's your thoughts on embers? Because this is your idea. I'm curious if you want to talk about it.
Oh, man. So embers to me is a little bit like, I think of clinical informatics of sitting at the intersection of two very data-driven disciplines. On the one hand, we come from the technology. We deal with the technology side, where we have very rigorous A/B testing to understand, human interactions and what users are doing, and use that to drive sort of UI changes and UX changes. And on the other side, we have evidence-based medicine, where we want to know what data supports treatments and interventions that we do with our patients. Clinical informatics historically has not had that same rigor from either of those data-driven disciplines, right? Like, many times we will implement things, give it a try, and we do, we are data-driven. We'll do surveys, we'll talk to people, measure the patient outcomes and quality. But for me, basically, Embers was potentially looking at, passively measuring a lot of the impact of these changes using either access logs or activity logs, or just things that people are doing in the system that are getting logged for one reason or another. And Embers would be, this is what's left behind after, the clinical fire has swept through. Yeah. And to understand what's been done. And I think that would actually be a nice way of almost creating sort of a evidence-based clinical informatics. Yeah. Or sort of like, I don't know, it's sort of merging those two disciplines, right? Evidence-based medicine and A/B testing.
And you could argue that some aspect that also helps with the learning health system and the concepts that build from that, where and just to give the analogy, and we can talk about this next episode if we'd like, but FHIR, Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, is the global standard for healthcare interoperability. And if you take these data elements and you look at the things that are tied to that, like your access log queries or other things that help add to evidence-based medicine or your learning health system, those are your embers that you can use to better guide your practice. I love that analogy, and I'm giving you credit because you came up with it while we were setting up our initial testing in this, and you were so happy about that. I love that.
So I don't know if we want to do this or not. Do you want to resurrect the tech, or I don't know, life hacks from our ASIF podcast?
Yeah, do they still do life hacks? They do recommendations.
I see.
But we can do it.
So my recent life hack is I now have a dual screen phone, which allows me to video conference and message at the same time or look up things, which I find really obnoxious. Like, especially, I don't know how much you use Google Meet, but it's like it just gets buried in your email in your Gmail app now, so it's hard to like go back and forth and find the meeting. So I find it much easier to like switch. Now I don't have to switch screens. I can just keep the Google Meet up. But then I still have my wallet on front, which is my favorite thing, because now I don't have, like for the last 10 years, I haven't had to carry, wallet, keys, and phone. Now it's been just phone and keys for a while now.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I guess I'll give a technical life hack, or at least some of the tech that we use. And I'll talk about the clicker. Should I talk about the clicker? I'm going to talk about this clicker.
Which you guys haven't heard because they've all been
Which you've never heard. Yeah. So if you're doing a podcast and you are figuring this stuff out at the beginning and you want to save yourself a lot of time and you say something and you want to edit that down, give yourself a timestamp. There's my timestamp. And so that tells me that I can be a little bit faster as I'm heading in to modify the discussion that we had, so that we can edit something down or make something a little bit shorter. It saves me time, it saves you time, and that comes from My Brother and Me's book on making a podcast, because that family has done this for over 11 years, and I love the stuff that they make, and I thought that was an excellent idea. So, yeah, thank you, Mabimbam and the McElroy family, because officially, now I got a clicker. Thank you. So,
link in the description below.
Link in the description below. Yes, exactly. So, with all of that said, thanks for joining us on Code Embers. I'm John Manning.
Mike Wang.
And take care, everyone. Stay safe out there.